New York City, the 1920s. The air hums with jazz, ambition, and the smell of opportunity, legal or otherwise. Beneath the city's glittering skyline, far from the champagne bubbles and the laughter of speakeasies, another world breathes. A world of shadows, whispers, and deals made at the edge of a knife. It is here, among the slums and smoke, that a boy from Sicily would rise to become the architect of modern organized crime. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a man both feared and admired, loved and loathed, a criminal visionary who redefined what power meant in the American underworld. To understand Luciano's rise is to step into the bloodstream of America itself, a young, restless country bursting with immigrants chasing the promise of fortune. The Lower East Side, where Luciano grew up, was a patchwork of languages and desperation. Streets teeming with peddlers, children darting through alleyways, and men who worked 12-hour shifts only to return home to overcrowded tenements. Poverty wasn't just an obstacle, it was a cage. And for many, crime wasn't a choice, it was survival. Luciano's story begins in this crucible. He wasn't born into privilege or power. He wasn't educated in fine schools or groomed by elites. He was a product of hunger, literal and metaphorical. As a child, he saw the divide between those who had and those who never would. He saw that law and justice were often just words, easily bent, often bought. In that realization lay the seed of his genius. He understood early what many adults never did, that the system could be played, that people could be controlled not just through violence, but through understanding their desires. This is the heart of Lucky Luciano's legend. Not simply the story of a gangster, but of a strategist. He wasn't the strongest, nor the most ruthless, but he was the smartest man in the room, the one who could see the invisible lines connecting politics, business, and crime. When others fought over scraps, he envisioned an empire. When others clung to the old mafia traditions of family feuds and honor codes, he dreamed of something new, a criminal corporation that could outlast generations. Yet this isn't a tale of triumph without consequence. Luciano's brilliance came at a cost. Every empire built on fear eventually cracks under its own weight. Every alliance, formed in the dark, carries the seeds of betrayal. And in the end, even the man who built the throne of crime couldn't escape the machinery of his own making. His story is Shakespearean in scale. Ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and downfall all played out under the flickering lights of America's roaring century. To tell this story, we have to travel through time, from the dusty streets of Sicily to the speakeasies of New York, from the chaos of Prohibition to the cold cells of Dannemora prison. We'll see how Luciano rose from a street kid with nothing to lose to the man who commanded the commission, a criminal boardroom that ruled the nation's underworld. We'll meet the allies who helped him: Meyer Lansky, the mathematical genius of crime; Frank Costello, the diplomat; and Bugsy Siegel, the wild gunman who dreamed of Las Vegas. Together, they didn't just make money, they made history. But what makes Luciano's story endure isn't just his criminal empire. It's his transformation, from the brutal world of Sicilian vendettas to a new kind of order built on reason and profit. He represented the evolution of crime in America, the shift from street violence to organized enterprise. Before him, gangsters were thugs with guns. After him, they were businessmen with armies. His influence shaped not only the mafia, but the entire psychology of organized power, from corporate boardrooms to political corridors. Even decades after his death, Luciano's ghost lingers. His fingerprints can be found in every corner of modern organized crime, from drug cartels to international syndicates. His philosophy, structure, discipline, and control became the blueprint for the underworld's globalization. And yet, behind the legend, there was still the man, a boy named Salvatore Lucania, who wanted more than life seemed willing to offer. A man who never stopped trying to prove that he could master the world that once looked down on him. As we unravel the story of Lucky Luciano, we'll explore not only how he built his empire, but why, the psychology behind the ambition, the loneliness behind the power, the human cost of greatness in the shadows. Because in the end, every king of crime faces the same truth, that the crown is heavy and the throne is built on sand. This is not just a chronicle of violence or corruption. It's a story about America itself, about the immigrant dream turned inside out, about how the hunger for success, when mixed with cunning and ruthlessness, can create both legends and monsters. And at its center stands one man, Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the prince of the underworld who turned crime into business, chaos into order, and his own name into immortality. The story begins not in power, but in poverty, not in triumph, but in struggle. Before there was Lucky Luciano, there was a boy on the streets, learning the laws of survival one fight, one deal, one betrayal at a time. And it is from those streets that he would rise all the way to the throne of crime. Before Lucky Luciano ever set foot on the streets of New York, the world he inherited was shaped by centuries of tradition, violence, and rigid codes of honor. Sicily, his birthplace, was a land of contradictions, breathtakingly beautiful yet harsh, fertile yet scarred by poverty. Life there was ruled not just by laws, but by loyalty, reputation, and a deeply ingrained system of vendettas. Families were bound by blood and honor, and disputes were settled with bullets as often as with words. For a boy like Luciano, these early lessons in loyalty, cunning, and survival would form the invisible scaffolding for the empire he would one day build. When the Lucania family emigrated to America in the early 1900s, they were part of a massive wave of Italians fleeing economic despair and seeking a new life. The streets of New York, however, were no paradise. Immigrants were crammed into overcrowded tenements, forced into grueling labor, and confronted daily with prejudice and marginalization. The American dream was often a cruel illusion. Opportunity existed, but only for those who could navigate the brutality of the urban jungle. In these streets, old-world lessons from Sicily collided with the chaotic modernity of a new world. The laws of survival changed. Fists and firearms replaced honor-bound duels, and cunning often outweighed pedigree. For the criminal underworld, this collision created fertile ground. The mafia that existed in America at the time was fragmented, disorganized, and ethnically compartmentalized. Italian gangs squabbled over neighborhoods. Irish gangs controlled other territories, and Jewish gangs carved out their own pockets of influence. Violence was constant, but there was little strategy, no overarching structure. Extortion, bootlegging, and street-level theft dominated, often leaving even the most ambitious men frustrated by their limited reach. It was a world where ambition collided with chaos, and where a sharp mind could rise faster than sheer strength alone. Luciano's genius lay in understanding this landscape. He recognized that the old-world feuds he had witnessed in Sicily were inadequate for America's sprawling metropolis. The rules that governed honor and vendetta were outdated when faced with prohibition, corrupt politicians, and the sheer scale of criminal opportunity in New York. While others fought over scraps, Luciano saw the bigger picture, a chance to build an empire that transcended ethnicity, that could govern disputes without constant bloodshed, and that could turn criminality into enterprise. The streets themselves became a classroom. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and East Harlem, Luciano observed the mechanisms of survival in real time. He watched families scrape by, men exploit every loophole, and gangs rise and fall with shocking speed. Every interaction was a lesson in psychology, negotiation, and influence. Every fight, every bribe, every betrayal taught him how power was wielded and how fragile it could be. From the chaos, he began to craft his own philosophy, that survival required more than violence. It required vision, strategy, and a mastery of human behavior. Meanwhile, the broader American context amplified the stakes. Prohibition, starting in 1920, was not just a legal restriction on alcohol. It was a seismic economic opportunity. Entire fortunes could be made overnight for those bold and ruthless enough to exploit it. For a generation of immigrants who were barred from traditional avenues of success, the black market became a legitimate arena for ambition. Luciano and his peers were at the perfect intersection, young, ambitious, and willing to push the boundaries of law and morality. The contrast between old-world tradition and new-world opportunity also shaped the alliances and rivalries that would define Luciano's early years. Some men clung to Sicilian codes, insisting on loyalty to family and region above all else. Others embraced the fluidity of the American criminal landscape, willing to cooperate across ethnic lines for profit. Luciano recognized that the future belonged to the latter, a fusion of old cunning and new flexibility. It was this insight that would allow him to navigate the treacherous waters of New York's gangs, ultimately positioning him as a visionary rather than just another street thug. Even culturally, this period left its mark. The Italian-American community was tight-knit, yet under constant pressure from discrimination, poverty, and political marginalization. Success, for men like Luciano, was not just a personal triumph. It was a defiance of the limitations imposed by society. Every victory was proof that intellect and ruthlessness could overcome circumstance. In a sense, Luciano's rise was inevitable once his talent met opportunity. The chaos of New York, combined with his Sicilian upbringing, created the perfect storm for a mastermind to emerge. By the time Luciano reached adolescence, he was already a product of both worlds, steeped in the codes and cunning of Sicily, yet fully aware of the limitless possibilities and dangers of America. He could navigate fear and respect, tradition and modernity, loyalty and betrayal. The streets were cruel teachers, but he absorbed their lessons with an instinct for strategy that few could rival. This duality, the old world and the new, would define every decision he made and every empire he built. In short, the world before Luciano was fragmented, violent, and ripe with opportunity. It was a place where survival demanded both ruthlessness and intelligence, where tradition clashed with ambition, and where a single visionary could reshape the rules entirely. Luciano was that visionary, and as he stepped further into New York's underworld, the foundations of the American Mafia were quietly being rewritten, one calculated move at a time. This is the world into which Lucky Luciano was born, a world of contrasts, danger, and possibility. A world that would forge him, challenge him, and ultimately allow him to rise from the shadows to the pinnacle of organized crime. Salvatore Lucania, later immortalized as Lucky Luciano, was born on November 24, 1897, in the small Sicilian town of Lercara. Nestled in the hills of Palermo province, the town was modest with cobblestone streets, crumbling stone houses, and a population struggling under the weight of poverty and rigid social hierarchies. Life in Sicily was a constant lesson in survival. Family honor, loyalty, and cunning were not optional virtues. They were necessities. Luciano's early years were shaped by this environment, where disputes were often settled with violence, and respect could be worth more than gold. From a young age, he learned that intelligence and strategy often mattered more than brute strength. When he was a small child, his family made the difficult decision to emigrate to America, joining the tide of Sicilian immigrants seeking better opportunities. Like many newcomers, the Lucanias landed in New York City with little more than hope and resilience. The Lower East Side, with its crowded tenements and bustling streets, was a world both fascinating and brutal. The smells of fresh bread, fish, and the occasional horse manure mingled with the cries of street vendors and children playing in alleyways. Immigrants fought daily for space, work, and survival. It was here that young Salvatore began his education in the school of the streets, an education far harsher than any classroom could provide. From an early age, Luciano displayed a remarkable combination of cunning and audacity. He learned quickly which fights were worth engaging and which were better avoided. He observed human behavior keenly. Who could be intimidated, who could be persuaded, and who would betray you without a second thought. The streets were unforgiving, and he knew that respect had to be earned, sometimes through violence, sometimes through negotiation, and sometimes simply through the aura of confidence. As a teenager, Luciano gravitated toward gangs that operated in and around Manhattan's Lower East Side. The Five Points Gang, notorious for its viciousness and influence, became his proving ground. Joining such an organization was not just about survival. It was about learning the rules of power in an environment where authority was fluid and constantly challenged. Luciano's early criminal activities were modest: street fights, petty theft, and running small errands for more powerful gang members. But each act was a stepping stone, a lesson in hierarchy, loyalty, and the mechanics of fear. Luciano's intelligence quickly set him apart from his peers. He had an instinct for reading people, identifying weaknesses, and exploiting opportunities. Unlike many gang members who relied solely on brute force, Luciano combined physical courage with mental acuity. He learned how to negotiate with rival factions, how to anticipate law enforcement moves, and, perhaps most importantly, how to cultivate loyalty without creating enemies unnecessarily. This combination of street smarts and strategic thinking marked him as someone destined for more than small-time crime. Family life also influenced Luciano's development. In an immigrant household, resources were scarce, and the pressure to succeed was immense. Parents expected children to contribute, and failure carried both social and personal consequences. For Luciano, this meant learning responsibility early while also cultivating a sense of independence. He developed a resilience that allowed him to endure physical threats, social rejection, and economic hardship, all while plotting his ascent in the criminal world. This duality, discipline at home, ruthlessness on the streets, would become a hallmark of his character. Friendships forged during this period were equally formative. Luciano allied himself with individuals who shared his ambition and intelligence, most notably Meyer Lansky, who would become a lifelong associate and partner in crime. Lansky brought a complementary skill set, financial savvy, and an understanding of broader criminal networks that perfectly balanced Luciano's street instincts and charisma. These early alliances demonstrated Luciano's ability to identify talent and use it to his advantage, a trait that would later define the structure and success of his criminal empire. Education, in the conventional sense, was limited. Luciano's formal schooling ended early, but he learned lessons that no classroom could provide. He absorbed the mechanics of power, the psychology of loyalty, and the strategic use of fear. Each street encounter was a study in negotiation, every gang dispute a lesson in leadership. By the time he reached his late teens, Luciano had already developed a framework for understanding the dynamics of control, how to balance violence and diplomacy, intimidation and incentive, loyalty and betrayal. Early brushes with law enforcement introduced him to the limitations of the legal system and the opportunities within it. Arrests for minor crimes were frequent, and each encounter with the police became a lesson in manipulation, bribery, and evasion. Luciano observed that authority could often be bent, and that influence, political, social, or financial, was as potent a weapon as any gun. This understanding of systemic corruption and the leverage it offered would later allow him to operate above the level of most street-level criminals. Yet it was not only survival and strategy that defined young Luciano. There was also a growing ambition, a hunger that extended beyond mere survival or local dominance. He dreamed of power and respect on a scale far larger than the cramped streets of Manhattan. Unlike many contemporaries who sought temporary advantage or fleeting fame, Luciano was already envisioning an empire, organized, efficient, and enduring. He understood that influence required networks, planning, and patience. This long-term perspective set him apart and foreshadowed the transformation he would bring to organized crime in America. In these formative years, the psychological seeds of Luciano's character were firmly planted. The streets taught him resilience, the gangs taught him hierarchy, family life taught him responsibility, and early alliances taught him the value of loyalty and trust. Each element combined to form a personality both magnetic and formidable, someone capable of commanding respect, inspiring loyalty, and instilling fear, all simultaneously. The boy from Lurkera Fritti was no ordinary immigrant. He was a strategist in the making, a man whose environment had honed his mind as sharply as any blade. By the time Luciano entered adulthood, the foundation was complete. He was streetwise, ambitious, and acutely aware of human psychology. The immigrant boy who had arrived in New York with little more than hope now possessed the tools to navigate its darkest corners and, ultimately, to dominate them. The early hardships, the alliances, the fights, the lessons from Sicily, and the brutal education of Manhattan streets all converged to create a singular figure. Lucky Luciano, the boy who would rise from the gutter to claim a throne of crime. His story was no longer about survival. It was about transformation, ambition, and the calculated pursuit of power in a world where only the clever, the ruthless, and the visionary could thrive. From these beginnings, the next chapters of Luciano's life would unfold, marked by audacity, violence, and the kind of strategic brilliance that would forever change organized crime in America. By the time Lucky Luciano reached his late teens, the Lower East Side had become more than just a home. It was his proving ground. The streets were unforgiving, a constant theater of survival where only the clever, ruthless, or lucky endured. Luciano was fortunate in all three. His early experiences with poverty, prejudice, and street fights had honed his instincts, and now he was ready to step beyond petty skirmishes into the organized world of gang influence. The boy from Lercara Fritti was becoming a man who could navigate not just the street brawls of New York, but the subtle, deadly politics of the criminal underworld. Luciano's initiation into the 5 Points gang marked a turning point. Unlike many street kids who joined gangs for protection or thrill, Luciano saw this as an opportunity for strategy and influence. The 5 Points were notorious for their violence, but they also served as a training ground in leadership, loyalty, and negotiation. Here, Luciano learned the unspoken rules of the streets: when to fight, when to intimidate, and when to negotiate. Every small job, running errands, collecting debts, or enforcing local claims, was a lesson in human behavior, power dynamics, and the careful orchestration of fear and respect. It was during this period that Luciano began cultivating his reputation. He was not the biggest or the strongest, but he was precise, intelligent, and fearless. Rumors spread quickly about his audacity and cleverness. Unlike his peers, who often relied solely on violence to establish dominance, Luciano combined aggression with calculated strategy. He understood that fear could be amplified when paired with unpredictability and intellect. A single decisive act performed at the right moment could secure respect for years. This skill would become one of his most potent weapons. Alliances formed during this time were crucial. Luciano surrounded himself with individuals whose talents complemented his own. Most notable among them was Meyer Lansky, a boy genius of numbers and strategy who brought an analytical mind to the otherwise chaotic criminal landscape. Lansky's vision of organized crime as a rational, profit-driven enterprise aligned perfectly with Luciano's approach. Together, they began thinking not just about local dominance, but about the larger architecture of power, alliances, business structures, and the monetization of crime. Another key figure was Bugsy Siegel, whose audacity and recklessness could be harnessed in service of larger plans. These relationships were early signs of Luciano's ability to recognize talent, manipulate ego, and coordinate action toward a common goal. Luciano also began refining his understanding of law enforcement. Early arrests had taught him that the legal system was neither uniform nor invincible. He observed which officers were corruptible, which precincts could be intimidated, and where discretion could be turned into leverage. While many young gangsters viewed arrests as setbacks, Luciano treated them as opportunities for observation and learning. He began understanding the delicate balance of fear, bribery, and influence, a balance that would allow him to operate above street-level thugs and below the radar of major law enforcement for years to come. The economic context of the era amplified these opportunities. Prohibition had created a black market economy worth millions, with alcohol smuggling, speakeasies, and underground distribution networks forming a lucrative web. While street-level gangs fought over neighborhoods and petty crimes, Luciano recognized a far greater potential. He saw that strategic partnerships across ethnic lines, combined with disciplined management of operations, could yield wealth and power on an unprecedented scale. Unlike traditionalists who clung to old mafia codes and petty rivalries, Luciano was focused on efficiency, scale, and sustainability. During these years, Luciano's personality began to crystallize into the blend of charm, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking that would define him. He learned to read a room, to persuade without coercion, and to inspire loyalty without fear alone. His leadership was subtle but absolute. He didn't just command, he orchestrated. He understood that the perception of control could be as powerful as control itself. This psychological sophistication set him apart from contemporaries, making him both a respected peer and a feared adversary. Violence remained a tool, but it was wielded selectively. Whereas other gangsters acted impulsively, Luciano calculated each strike, each intimidation, each alliance. He recognized that indiscriminate brutality could destabilize potential networks and draw unwanted law enforcement attention. In essence, he was learning to treat crime as an enterprise with long-term strategic goals, risk management, and the careful allocation of human resources. This approach distinguished him from his peers and foreshadowed his future as the architect of the modern American Mafia. By his early 20s, Luciano had begun to attract attention not only for his street exploits but for his vision. He was recognized as someone capable of seeing beyond the immediate, a thinker in a world dominated by reactionary violence. His charisma allowed him to negotiate with rival gangs, brokers, and corrupt officials, while his ruthless efficiency ensured compliance and respect. The transformation from street punk to rising mobster was now complete. He was no longer just a survivor of the Lower East Side. He was a strategist, a leader, and a man with a vision for power that extended far beyond any single neighborhood or gang. Yet, this ascent was not without risk. The criminal underworld was inherently unstable, full of jealousy, betrayal, and sudden violence. Allies could turn into enemies overnight, and a single misstep could mean death. Luciano's ability to navigate this volatility relied not only on his intelligence, but on his psychological insight, an understanding of human motivation, greed, and fear. He began to see the patterns that others missed, which alliances were temporary, which enemies could be neutralized, and how influence could be leveraged to create durable structures of power. As Luciano moved toward adulthood, he was already shaping the contours of a criminal empire. His street experience, alliances, strategic thinking, and psychological insight were converging into a formula for success. From the chaotic alleys of Manhattan to the volatile networks of organized crime, he was building both the skill set and the reputation necessary to rise to the highest echelons of the underworld. The boy from Lurker Afridi had become more than a survivor. He had become a rising force, a mobster not merely defined by violence, but by vision, intelligence, and the capacity to see opportunities where others saw only chaos. In this phase of his life, the foundation was laid for everything that would follow. Luciano's early adulthood was a period of learning, experimentation, and subtle conquest. He had mastered the streets, built alliances, and begun to understand the architecture of power. He was ready to step onto a larger stage, the world of prohibition, bootlegging, and high-stakes criminal enterprise. From street punk to rising mobster, Luciano was preparing to reshape the American underworld forever. The 1920s in America were a time of contradictions. The nation was roaring with energy, jazz clubs filled with laughter and music, and skyscrapers rose like monuments to progress. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity lay an era defined by prohibition, a legal ban on alcohol that transformed ordinary citizens into lawbreakers and created an unparalleled opportunity for organized crime. For lucky Luciano, this was the moment that would define his career. Prohibition was not merely a law to evade. It was a multi-billion-dollar business waiting for someone with vision, ruthlessness, and the ability to organize on a scale no one had imagined. Luciano had already demonstrated the cunning and street smarts necessary to survive the brutal environment of New York's gangs. But prohibition required more than survival. It demanded strategy. Millions of Americans were willing to risk arrest for a drink, creating a black market economy that dwarfed any traditional criminal enterprise. Speakeasies popped up on every corner, while bootleggers, smugglers, and gangsters became the new businessmen of the underground. Luciano understood that to succeed in this world, he needed more than muscle. He needed intelligence, connections, and a vision for a system that could function like a legitimate enterprise. At the heart of this boom was alcohol, the commodity that fueled both desire and danger. Every shipment smuggled in from Canada or overseas, every clandestine speakeasy, every illegal distillery was a chance to seize power and accumulate wealth. For street gangs, these opportunities were often chaotic and uncoordinated, with violence erupting over territorial disputes and shipment hijackings. Luciano saw this chaos not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. He began envisioning a network where supply, distribution, and enforcement could be controlled, reducing wasteful infighting and maximizing profit. Crucially, Luciano also understood the role of alliances. The old mafia, bound by strict ethnic loyalties, often limited themselves to Sicilian or Italian networks. Luciano, however, was pragmatic. He sought partnerships wherever they could increase efficiency and security. Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were not merely associates. They were equal partners in a vision that transcended ethnicity. Together, they built networks for smuggling, distribution, and collection that were unprecedented in scale. Luciano was no longer a street-level thug. He was orchestrating complex operations that required trust, negotiation, and coordination across multiple factions. Rothstein, the legendary gambler and crime financier, also influenced Luciano during this period. Arnold Rothstein was a man who had transformed crime into business, and Luciano recognized the lessons implicit in Rothstein's empire. Diversification, strategy, and discretion were as valuable as violence. By absorbing these lessons, Luciano was learning to think like a capitalist, applying these principles to the black market economy of prohibition. Each shipment of alcohol, each bribe, each territorial negotiation became part of a broader business strategy, allowing him to expand his influence far beyond the Lower East Side. The Prohibition era also honed Luciano's ability to manipulate law enforcement and political connections. Bribery became a standard operational cost, and relationships with corrupt officials were as essential as alliances with gangsters. Luciano realized that power was not only derived from fear, but also from influence over the institutions meant to suppress crime. A well-placed bribe or a carefully cultivated informant could neutralize rivals and protect operations. This understanding of systemic leverage would define his approach to power throughout his career. As profits grew, so did ambition. Luciano was no longer content with small-time operations or street-level control. He envisioned a network capable of operating across boroughs, coordinating multiple gangs, and centralizing authority. This was the genesis of modern organized crime, a system where disputes could be managed internally, resources allocated efficiently, and influence extended over politics, unions, and law enforcement. Luciano's vision was not for chaos, but for order, a corporate mafia capable of surviving beyond the whims of individual leaders or temporary feuds. Yet, the boom was not without danger. Rival gangs, territorial disputes, and law enforcement crackdowns posed constant threats. Violence was never far from the equation, and Luciano learned to balance the threat of force with strategic diplomacy. He realized that his reputation, carefully cultivated, could often achieve what guns could not. Fear, respect, and loyalty became interchangeable tools, wielded with precision. Every deal was an exercise in psychology as much as logistics. Every shipment, a test of influence and foresight. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had firmly established himself as a rising power in New York's underworld. He was no longer a street-level enforcer, but a manager, strategist, and visionary. His operations were profitable, organized, and far-reaching. The bootlegging boom had given him both the financial resources and the organizational experience to begin thinking about larger-scale transformations in the mafia itself. He had learned how to turn opportunity into empire, chaos into order, and ambition into power. This era also solidified the principles that would define his leadership: pragmatism over tradition, intelligence over brute force, and loyalty managed through both reward and fear. Luciano's experience in the bootlegging business was not merely a path to wealth. It was an apprenticeship in strategy, negotiation, and large-scale organization. He was learning the mechanics of influence, the psychology of loyalty, and the subtle art of commanding respect without inciting unnecessary conflict. By the end of the 1920s, Luciano's reputation had spread beyond the streets of Manhattan. He was seen as a man who could achieve what others could not: order within chaos, profit within risk, and loyalty within a world defined by betrayal. The bootlegging boom had transformed him from a street-smart gangster into a criminal visionary, a man ready to reshape the underworld entirely. He had both the tools and the ambition to challenge the old guard, to dismantle outdated hierarchies, and to build an empire that could endure beyond any individual's lifespan. Prohibition would not last forever, but for Luciano, its legacy was far more enduring. It had taught him the value of organization, the necessity of alliances, and the power of vision. The money was only a symptom. The real lesson was in control, strategy, and influence. From the chaos of illicit alcohol, Luciano had learned to see the larger game. The streets, the alleys, and the speakeasies had become his laboratory. Here, he was no longer a boy fighting for survival. He was a strategist, a manager, and a future architect of the modern mafia. The bootlegging boom had elevated Luciano from street punk to a man whose ambitions extended far beyond the Lower East Side. It was the era in which he transformed from participant to orchestrator, from reactive survivor to proactive visionary. And as the decade drew to a close, Luciano was poised to take the next step, turning his criminal operations into an organized empire capable of governing the underworld with precision, efficiency, and ruthless intelligence. The lessons of prohibition, scale, alliances, leverage, and strategy would become the blueprint for everything Luciano would build afterward. From this chaotic opportunity, he was learning not only how to survive, but how to dominate. And with each shipment, each partnership, and each calculated move, Lucky Luciano's path toward the throne of crime was becoming unmistakably clear. Amid the chaos of New York's criminal underworld in the 1920s, Lucky Luciano began to envision something that few could even imagine: a world where crime could be organized, disputes settled without constant bloodshed, and power centralized in a way that transcended loyalty to a single family or ethnic group. This vision was born from experience. Luciano had seen the destructive consequences of rivalries between gangs, the inefficiency of violence-driven decisions, and the vulnerability of fragmented operations to law enforcement and opportunistic competitors. He realized that survival alone was not enough. To truly dominate, he needed structure, discipline, and order. Luciano's vision marked a radical departure from the old mafia traditions. Sicilian gangs had long operated on rigid codes of honor and family loyalty, often resulting in deadly feuds that decimated their ranks and limited their influence. Power was inherited, disputes were settled with vendettas, and ambition was constrained by loyalty to kin and tradition. Luciano, shaped by the pragmatism of the streets and the opportunities presented by prohibition, understood that such systems were inefficient. To succeed on a larger scale, he needed a model that valued results over heritage, cooperation over animosity, and strategy over instinct. The first step toward this order was forging alliances that transcended ethnic and organizational boundaries. Luciano understood that the future of organized crime lay in collaboration, not isolation. He allied himself with figures like Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and other Jewish gangsters, breaking the traditional Italian-only mold. These alliances were not mere convenience. They were strategic partnerships grounded in shared vision, complementary skills, and mutual benefit. Together, they could control operations that spanned the city, coordinating bootlegging, gambling, and other enterprises with unprecedented efficiency. But alliances alone were not enough. Luciano also began to conceptualize the mechanisms of conflict resolution and governance within the criminal world. He realized that unchecked violence among gangs not only weakened their operations, but also attracted the attention of law enforcement. If crime could be managed through negotiation, compromise, and strategic enforcement, the profits would increase and the risks would decrease. This understanding was revolutionary. Crime could be conducted like a business, with a hierarchy, rules, and mechanisms to mediate disputes. Luciano's early experiments in creating this order were subtle but significant. He mediated disputes between rival gangs, brokered deals across neighborhoods, and established informal protocols for conducting business. These were not one-off interventions. They were the foundation for a new model of governance. His approach was pragmatic. Loyalty and cooperation were incentivized, betrayal and violence punished, and the reputation of leaders cultivated to maintain authority. In essence, Luciano was creating a framework that would allow organized crime to survive and thrive, even as individual players came and went. Psychology played a critical role in this vision. Luciano understood human motivation better than most of his contemporaries. Fear, respect, ambition, and greed were all tools to be leveraged. By carefully balancing intimidation with opportunity, he could influence behavior without constant displays of brute force. Members of his network knew that compliance brought rewards and that defiance carried consequences, but they also recognized that loyalty to Luciano offered long-term protection and prosperity. This subtle manipulation of human behavior was as important as any gun or bootleg shipment. It was the invisible glue that held his emerging empire together. The dream of order also extended to the integration of legal and political influence. Luciano had already begun to understand the power of corruption, influence, and strategic bribery. He cultivated relationships with politicians, police, and other figures who could be useful to his operations. By doing so, he created a system where his criminal enterprises could function with minimal interference from the law. This combination of organizational discipline, alliances, and influence marked the birth of a modern, corporate-style mafia, a network that could operate efficiently, absorb shocks, and outlast individual actors. Importantly, Luciano's vision was ambitious in scale. He was not content with controlling a single neighborhood or operating a single racketeering business. He sought to unify the city's disparate criminal elements under a set of shared rules and governance principles. This was the foundation for what would later become the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and establish a collective strategy for organized crime. The dream of order was not merely about personal power. It was about creating a sustainable system that could outlive any single boss and institutionalize criminal enterprise across New York and, eventually, the nation. Emotionally, this period reflected Luciano's ambition and pragmatism. He was driven by a desire not just to survive or profit, but to create something enduring, something systematic. His approach blended idealism with ruthlessness. He envisioned a world in which chaos could be tamed, yet he was fully prepared to use violence when necessary to protect and enforce his vision. This duality, strategic intellect combined with a willingness to act decisively, became the defining characteristic of his leadership style. The streets of New York, once a battlefield of unending feuds, were gradually transformed under Luciano's influence. Violence was no longer senseless, it was tactical. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was earned and managed. Alliances were not temporary. They were structured and strategic. Through these efforts, Luciano laid the groundwork for a new era of organized crime. one where efficiency, influence, and coordination replaced the chaos, mistrust, and brutality of previous generations. By the late 1920s, it was clear that Luciano was no ordinary gangster. He had moved beyond survival and street-level dominance. He was a visionary, architecting a criminal system capable of sustained control, enormous profit, and internal stability. The dream of order, once abstract, was becoming tangible, a network of alliances, rules, and strategies that would redefine the mafia and cement Luciano's place as its central figure. In this phase, the lines between ambition, strategy, and morality were blurred. Luciano was building power, yes, but he was also reshaping the social and psychological dynamics of the criminal world. He was demonstrating that intelligence and organization could achieve more than brute force, that loyalty could be managed through respect and reward rather than fear alone, and that the old codes of honor could be reimagined for a modern, American context. The dream of order was the blueprint for everything to come. It was the idea that would guide his next moves during the Castellamarese War, the formation of the Commission, and the consolidation of his empire. It was the principle that elevated Luciano from a successful bootlegger and street strategist to the visionary leader who would transform organized crime in America. Through this vision, the chaotic streets of New York became his laboratory, and the underworld began to bend to his design. Luciano's genius lay in seeing the possibility of structure within disorder. While others fought and killed over scraps, he imagined systems, networks, and governance. He was not merely building an empire. He was rewriting the rules of crime itself. The dream of order was more than ambition. It was a philosophy, a methodology, and a promise that the chaos of the streets could be transformed into a lasting, controllable machine of power. By the late 1920s, New York's Italian-American underworld was a tinderbox, and Lucky Luciano was ready to step onto a stage that would define his destiny. The Castellamarese War, which erupted in 1929, was more than a gangland feud. It was a brutal, citywide conflict between rival mafia factions that threatened to destroy the fragile underworld order. On one side stood Joe Masuria, the reigning boss of bosses, a traditionalist who clung to old Sicilian codes and ruthless methods. Opposing him was Salvatore Maranzano, a charismatic yet ambitious challenger, backed by Sicilian loyalists from Castellamare, the same town many American gangsters, including Luciano, traced their roots to. The war began as a clash of personalities, loyalties, and old-world ideologies. Masuria's faction emphasized strict adherence to traditional mafia hierarchies, personal loyalty, and vengeance for perceived slights. Maranzano's camp, while also steeped in tradition, was more flexible, willing to adapt to the realities of a modern, American criminal enterprise. The streets of New York became battlefields. Drive-by shootings, assassinations, and ambushes were commonplace. Everyday life for Italian neighborhoods was punctuated by fear, as even civilians could be collateral damage in these bloody disputes. The violence sent a clear message. In this war, survival required cunning, alliances, and a willingness to betray even the closest associates. Luciano, positioned between these titanic forces, played a delicate and dangerous game. Though young, he had already demonstrated intelligence, strategy, and a capacity for leadership. He recognized that blind loyalty could be fatal, yet outright betrayal without strategy would invite retaliation. He began to navigate these waters with remarkable skill, aligning himself strategically while keeping his ultimate goals in mind. Luciano had no desire to die for a dying system. He sought to reshape it entirely. The war itself was a crucible, testing loyalties, strategy, and courage. Many gangsters chose sides based on family ties or fear of reprisal, but Luciano's approach was pragmatic. He cultivated relationships across both factions, understanding that information, alliances, and timing were more powerful than guns alone. His friendship with Meyer Lansky and other forward-thinking partners gave him insight into opportunities that others overlooked. While Masuria and Maranzano waged open conflict, Luciano quietly positioned himself as the arbiter and strategist who could influence outcomes in his favor. Violence reached its peak in the early months of 1931, as both factions attempted to consolidate power. Masuria's forces had the advantage in numbers and brutal reputation, but Maranzano's supporters were clever, loyal, and deadly. Streets of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens became theaters of calculated murder. Drive-by shootings and targeted assassinations were common. For Luciano, the challenge was not only to survive, but to identify the precise moment when action could change the course of the war. Timing was everything, and hesitation could mean death. Luciano's decisive brilliance came in his willingness to betray without losing control. He recognized that both Masuria and Maranzano were obstacles to a more modern, unified vision of organized crime. Masuria, in particular, was an obstacle. His rigid adherence to tradition, while once effective, threatened to perpetuate endless cycles of violence and inefficiency. Luciano understood that eliminating these figures required precision, secrecy, and the careful orchestration of trust and deception. He began to plan moves that would simultaneously ensure his survival and create the opening for his ascent to power. The culmination of this strategy came with the assassination of Joe Masuria. In April 1931, Luciano orchestrated a meeting under the guise of loyalty. The meeting, held at a Coney Island restaurant, was ostensibly a negotiation, but it was a meticulously calculated trap. Luciano's associates executed the hit, removing the dominant traditionalist leader from the equation. Masuria's death sent shockwaves through the underworld, dismantling the old guard and creating a vacuum ripe for innovation. Yet even with Masuria gone, the war was not over. Salvatore Maranzano moved to consolidate power, declaring himself the new boss of bosses. Maranzano attempted to impose strict hierarchies and revive old-world rules, directly challenging Luciano's vision of a modern, organized system. The tension between ambition and pragmatism intensified. Luciano recognized that to implement his dream of order, Maranzano, too, had to be removed. What followed was a second, equally calculated betrayal. Using careful planning, Luciano arranged the assassination of Maranzano in September 1931. The hit was executed with precision, leaving Maranzano dead and Luciano free to implement his vision. The Castellamarese War was more than a violent power struggle. It was a crucible that tested Luciano's strategic genius. He demonstrated the ability to survive, manipulate, and ultimately control the outcome of events that had destroyed many of his contemporaries. The war solidified his reputation as both ruthless and intelligent, capable of navigating a world where loyalty was fluid, betrayal was constant, and survival depended on foresight rather than brute strength alone. Beyond the immediate violence, the war also shaped the psychological framework of the modern mafia. Luciano learned that leadership required more than fear or charisma. It required strategy, vision, and an understanding of human behavior. Control could be exercised through alliances, incentives, and subtle manipulation just as effectively as through violence. He also saw the limitations of tradition. The rigidity of old-world codes often resulted in unnecessary conflict and inefficiency. These lessons would directly inform his later creation of the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and maintain order among families. Emotionally, the war marked a transformation in Luciano himself. He emerged not only as a survivor, but as a decisive architect of the underworld's future. Where others had been trapped by loyalty or ideology, Luciano demonstrated the ability to think beyond the present, to calculate risk, and to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. The war was a baptism by fire, forging a leader who could command respect, inspire loyalty, and strike fear without relying solely on brute force. In hindsight, the Castellamarese War was a turning point for organized crime in America. It cleared the old guard, removed outdated hierarchies, and created the conditions for a new era. Luciano's vision of a structured, cooperative, and efficient criminal enterprise could now be implemented. His ability to combine strategy, alliances, and calculated violence set a template for modern organized crime that would endure for decades. By the end of 1931, Lucky Luciano stood at the pinnacle of New York's underworld. The streets had tested him, rivals had tried to kill him, and through cunning, patience, and decisiveness, he had not only survived but emerged in control. The old mafia order had been swept away, and in its place, Luciano's vision of a modern, disciplined, and organized criminal empire was ready to take root. The war was over, but its lessons, the necessity of strategy, the power of alliances, and the inevitability of betrayal, would echo throughout Luciano's career and the history of organized crime itself. The commission was more than an organizational tool. It was the embodiment of Luciano's vision for a modern, rational, and sustainable criminal empire. It institutionalized his philosophy, extended his influence, and laid the foundation for the global evolution of organized crime. Through this creation, Lucky Luciano had transformed not only the streets of New York, but the very nature of power within the American Mafia. The commission was more than an organizational tool. It was the embodiment of Luciano's vision for a modern, rational, and sustainable criminal empire. It institutionalized his philosophy, extended his influence, and laid the foundation for the global evolution of organized crime. Through this creation, Lucky Luciano had transformed not only the streets of New York, but the very nature of power within the American Mafia. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had solidified his position at the top of New York's criminal underworld. Yet power in a mafia was never absolute, and the line between ally and enemy was often razor-thin. Survival and dominance required not just strength and vision, but an uncanny ability to read human behavior, anticipate betrayal, and cultivate strategic alliances. Luciano's genius lay in navigating this complex social and psychological landscape, transforming relationships into tools of influence and control. Alliances were essential to Luciano's strategy. Figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were not just associates. They were extensions of his intellect and ambition. Lansky's financial acumen complemented Luciano's strategic instincts, while Siegel's boldness and audacity could be harnessed to execute high-risk operations. These partnerships exemplified Luciano's ability to recognize talent, allocate responsibilities effectively, and create a network in which each member contributed to a larger, coordinated vision. Loyalty was encouraged through shared profit, mutual protection, and the implicit understanding that betrayal carried deadly consequences. Yet even as Luciano cultivated loyalty, he remained acutely aware that betrayal could come from any quarter. The Mafia was a world where ambition, fear, and resentment could turn friends into foes overnight. Figures once considered allies, gangsters, political contacts, or even family members could shift allegiances if it served their interests. Luciano mitigated this risk by carefully balancing trust with surveillance, ensuring that no single individual possessed enough power to challenge him unilaterally. He maintained networks of informants, cultivated relationships across factions, and constantly assessed the shifting dynamics of influence. The tension between loyalty and betrayal played out vividly in Luciano's interactions with rival families. Even within the commission, conflicts over territory, profits, and influence were inevitable. Luciano approached these disputes with a combination of diplomacy and subtle intimidation. He was willing to negotiate, compromise, and mediate disputes when it served his strategic goals, but he never hesitated to act decisively against those who threatened his vision or authority. This dual approach, balancing trust and fear, reinforced his reputation as both a respected leader and a formidable adversary. Psychologically, Luciano understood that loyalty was as much a perception as a reality. By projecting confidence, fairness, and authority, he inspired devotion even among those who might otherwise question his decisions. At the same time, he cultivated an aura of unpredictability, reminding associates that betrayal carried immediate consequences. This careful manipulation of human behavior allowed him to maintain cohesion within his network, reducing internal conflict while maximizing operational efficiency. Not all alliances were permanent. Some were tactical, formed to address immediate challenges or opportunities. Others were long-term, grounded in mutual benefit and shared vision. Luciano's skill lay in discerning which relationships required nurturing and which needed to be controlled or eliminated. The ability to make these judgments quickly, decisively, and without hesitation was a hallmark of his leadership. In this way, he transformed loyalty and betrayal from mere survival mechanisms into instruments of strategy and empire building. Enemies, too, were a critical component of Luciano's calculus. He recognized that opposition could take many forms: rival gangsters, corrupt officials, competing interests within unions or businesses, and even law enforcement. Rather than confronting threats blindly, he assessed the motivations, vulnerabilities, and alliances of potential adversaries. By understanding the psychology and incentives of his enemies, Luciano could neutralize them through negotiation, strategic manipulation, or, when necessary, violence. In this high-stakes environment, foresight was as important as firepower. The interplay of loyalty and betrayal also extended to the broader criminal landscape. Luciano's vision of a structured, cooperative underworld depended on the ability to manage competing egos, ambitions, and interests. The Commission provided a framework for resolving disputes, but the enforcement of its rules relied on trust in Luciano's judgment and authority. Those who doubted his leadership or acted against his directives were swiftly marginalized or eliminated, ensuring that the balance of power remained intact. Emotionally, navigating this web of allies and enemies required both detachment and calculation. Luciano could inspire devotion without sentimentality and enforce obedience without cruelty that was gratuitous. His relationships were transactional, but they were underpinned by an understanding of human nature: what drives loyalty, what provokes fear, and how ambition can be harnessed or redirected. This psychological sophistication allowed him to maintain control over a volatile, high-stakes network where the margin for error was minimal. By carefully orchestrating alliances and neutralizing threats, Luciano created an ecosystem in which loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished, and strategic collaboration maximized. His ability to navigate this treacherous landscape not only secured his position at the top of New York's underworld, but also reinforced the principles of the modern mafia: cooperation, structure, and calculated enforcement. In essence, this period of Luciano's life highlighted the duality that would define his leadership: charm and ruthlessness, diplomacy and intimidation, vision and decisive action. He understood that power was rarely absolute, and that survival required constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and a nuanced grasp of human psychology. By mastering the delicate balance between allies and enemies, Luciano ensured that his empire was not only resilient, but capable of enduring the pressures, threats, and betrayals that had destroyed lesser figures in the criminal world. The lessons of this era were clear. In the mafia, loyalty could be cultivated, betrayal anticipated, and enemies neutralized, but only through intelligence, calculation, and psychological insight. Luciano's ability to navigate this dangerous landscape cemented his reputation as a leader who was as cerebral as he was ruthless, as strategic as he was fearless. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for an underworld that operated not merely on violence, but on structure, negotiation, and the careful orchestration of human behavior, a model that would define organized crime for generations. Even the most powerful figures are not invincible, and by the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's meteoric rise had begun to attract the attention of law enforcement, politicians, and rivals alike. His dominance over New York's underworld, though impressive, came with inherent risks. The very alliances, wealth, and influence that had secured his empire also created vulnerability. In 1936, these vulnerabilities would converge, setting in motion the events that marked the beginning of Luciano's dramatic fall from the heights of power. The investigation that led to Luciano's arrest was meticulous and relentless. Federal authorities had grown increasingly frustrated with organized crime's reach into labor unions, gambling, and political corruption. Luciano, as the architect of the commission and the operator of expansive criminal networks, had become a primary target. Authorities focused on his activities in prostitution and racketeering, recognizing that these charges were both prosecutable and publicly scandalous. For the first time, Luciano confronted the reality that no amount of strategy or influence could make him untouchable. Luciano's arrest was not merely a matter of legal enforcement. It was a symbolic blow to his empire. For the underworld, it was a stark reminder that power was contingent and that even the most cunning operators could be ensnared. Yet, what made this moment particularly significant was the sense of betrayal that accompanied it. Some of Luciano's closest allies and associates, under pressure from law enforcement or their own self-interest, provided testimony or information that would prove critical in his prosecution. Loyalty in the underworld, once carefully cultivated, had its limits. Fear, coercion, and survival instincts could override bonds forged in blood and strategy. The charges against Luciano were serious: running a prostitution ring, organized racketeering, and violations of state and federal law. The prosecution meticulously detailed his operations, linking him to a network of criminal enterprises that spanned the city. Media coverage was relentless, painting Luciano as the embodiment of organized crime's menace to society. The public fascination with his rise and ruthless efficiency now turned to scrutiny and condemnation. For a man who had carefully controlled perception as much as power, this exposure represented a profound loss of control. Behind the scenes, Luciano's own associates navigated a dangerous moral and strategic landscape. Some sought to distance themselves, fearing implication or prosecution. Others negotiated quietly with authorities to reduce their own sentences. In a world governed by loyalty and fear, betrayal was both inevitable and instrumental in his downfall. Luciano had mastered the delicate balance of human behavior on the streets, but the courtroom, where law, evidence, and coercion intersected, was a different battlefield. His ability to manipulate fear and loyalty was now being tested against a system structured to dismantle influence and power. Despite his predicament, Luciano's approach remained calculated. He sought to minimize personal damage while preserving the structural integrity of his empire. Bribes, legal maneuvering, and the strategic deployment of allies were employed in a final effort to maintain influence even as legal forces closed in. Yet, the combination of testimony, evidence, and public scrutiny made it clear that he could not simply negotiate his way out. The empire he had built with foresight, cunning, and vision was now vulnerable to forces beyond his immediate control. The arrest marked a turning point in Luciano's life. For the first time, the gap between his ambition and his mortality became starkly visible. The streets that had once been a laboratory for his genius were no longer protective. They offered no immunity against the reach of law and betrayal. Psychologically, this period was a test of resilience, strategy, and adaptation. Luciano faced not only the threat of long-term imprisonment, but also the erosion of the network he had painstakingly constructed. It was a moment that underscored the precarious nature of power in a world where loyalty could be compromised, and survival required both cunning and luck. Betrayal, however, was not just an external force. It was a reflection of the system Luciano had created. In centralizing power and creating complex alliances, he had made himself the focal point of scrutiny. Allies who had once relied on his vision and protection now found themselves bargaining with the law to secure their own futures. The mechanisms of loyalty he had engineered were powerful, but they were not infallible. The fall began not with a single act of weakness, but with the cumulative weight of exposure, coercion, and human self-interest. The consequences of this period extended beyond Luciano's personal fortunes. The empire he had built was tested under pressure, forcing adaptations and shifts in leadership. Some operations continued under trusted lieutenants, while others were restructured to reduce vulnerability. The arrest highlighted the fragility of even the most meticulously organized criminal networks, and it foreshadowed the challenges that Luciano would face in attempting to maintain influence from behind bars. Emotionally, this chapter was complex. For Luciano, it was a humbling confrontation with the limits of power. For the public and law enforcement, it was the moment when the myth of invincibility surrounding the mafia's architect began to crack. And for his associates, it was a test of loyalty, greed, and pragmatism. The fall began not as a violent collapse, but as a strategic and psychological unraveling, illustrating that in the underworld, even the most brilliant minds could be undone by a combination of law, betrayal, and circumstance. In retrospect, Luciano's arrest was not the end. It was the beginning of a different phase of influence. Though he would be physically removed from the streets, the networks he had created, the principles of the commission, and the loyalty he had cultivated would allow him to exert power in new, more subtle ways. The fall began with arrest and betrayal, but it also set the stage for a transformation. From a public, visible architect of organized crime to a behind-the-scenes strategist who could manipulate events and people from confinement. The arrest of Lucky Luciano, thus, serves as a study in the duality of power and vulnerability. Even the most visionary leaders are not immune to the forces of law, human self-interest, and shifting alliances. The world he had meticulously structured proved resilient enough to survive his temporary absence. But the psychological impact of betrayal and confinement would leave an indelible mark on the man who had once seemed untouchable. Lucky Luciano's arrest marked the beginning of a highly publicized legal battle that would become one of the most famous trials in American criminal history. Unlike the street-level violence of his rise, this was a confrontation fought in courtrooms, under the scrutiny of media, politicians, and an anxious public. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a test of Luciano's intellect, reputation, and psychological resilience. For the first time, he faced the full force of a system designed to dismantle his carefully constructed empire. The charges against Luciano were severe, running a vast prostitution ring, organized racketeering, and a litany of criminal offenses spanning multiple jurisdictions. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind behind a sprawling underworld, a man who had corrupted unions, bribed officials, and exploited women and labor for profit. The media eagerly amplified this narrative, presenting Luciano as the embodiment of organized crime's threat to American society. Headlines declared him the king of the underworld, but with a tone of moral outrage that contrasted sharply with the calculated, almost clinical way Luciano had built his empire. Despite the public spectacle, Luciano approached the trial strategically. He understood that perception was as critical as the facts themselves. In the courtroom, every gesture, word, and expression was part of a larger game. Defense attorneys meticulously challenged the evidence, sought to discredit witnesses, and attempted to exploit procedural technicalities. Luciano himself remained composed, projecting confidence and detachment, aware that a calm demeanor could influence jurors, journalists, and even prosecutors. Every detail mattered. The trial was as much about shaping public opinion as it was about avoiding conviction. Testimony against Luciano was extensive and damning. Former associates, under pressure or seeking leniency, recounted his operations in detail. The prosecution outlined the scope of the prostitution ring, detailing payments, locations, and the hierarchy that connected street-level enforcers to Luciano himself. Evidence of bribery and corruption in law enforcement and unions further bolstered the case. The courtroom became a theater of contradictions. The brilliant strategist of the streets now confronted the cold, methodical machinery of the law. For a man accustomed to controlling both perception and circumstance, this was a new and formidable challenge. Psychologically, The trial tested every facet of Luciano's resilience. He faced betrayal from former allies, the relentless scrutiny of the press, and the looming possibility of a life-altering sentence. Unlike the streets, where fear, loyalty, and cunning could manipulate outcomes, the courtroom operated on rules, evidence, and procedural power. Luciano had to adapt, applying his intelligence in a domain where brute force and intimidation were irrelevant. His capacity to remain calm, assess risk, and respond strategically was as critical here as it had been in the deadly alleys and boardrooms of organized crime. Despite a skilled defense, the weight of evidence and public sentiment proved overwhelming. In 1936, Luciano was convicted on multiple counts, including compulsory prostitution, and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentence was a dramatic reversal of fortune for a man who had once seemed untouchable. Yet even in this moment of legal defeat, Luciano's mind remained strategic. He quickly began assessing how to maintain influence, protect his interests, and leverage opportunities from confinement, a testament to his adaptability and foresight. The trial also marked a turning point in public awareness of organized crime. For the first time, Americans saw the intricate networks, alliances, and strategies that underpin the underworld. The sensationalized reporting, combined with courtroom revelations, created a narrative of both fascination and fear. Luciano's charisma, intelligence, and audacity captured the public imagination even as he faced condemnation. He became a symbol of the modern mafia, powerful, intelligent, and capable of operating with remarkable sophistication, yet vulnerable to the law and the consequences of betrayal. Emotionally, the trial was a confrontation with the limits of power. Luciano had mastered violence, strategy, and human behavior, yet the courtroom operated under different rules. Here, influence was limited, and even the most loyal allies could be coerced or compelled to testify. This reality reinforced a crucial lesson. Power is never absolute, and even the most formidable leaders are subject to forces beyond their control. For Luciano, it was both a humbling experience and a new arena in which to exercise his intelligence and strategic thinking. Despite the conviction, Luciano's approach to the sentence demonstrated his characteristic pragmatism. He recognized that imprisonment did not necessarily equate to the end of influence. Through careful planning, relationships within the prison system, and continued oversight of his network, he sought to maintain authority and protect the structures he had built. The trial, then, was not just a confrontation with law, but also an opportunity to test the resilience of his empire under pressure. The sentence also had profound implications for organized crime. It demonstrated that even the most powerful figures could be legally challenged, altering the behavior of both allies and rivals. At the same time, it reinforced the need for the structural innovations Luciano had championed, including the commission, which could operate collectively even when individual leaders faced legal jeopardy. The trial highlighted the importance of governance, foresight, and strategic planning in a criminal empire, principles that would ensure continuity despite personal setbacks. In conclusion, the trial and sentence of Lucky Luciano were not merely legal events. They were pivotal moments in the evolution of the American Mafia. They revealed both the vulnerabilities and strengths of a man who had reshaped organized crime through vision, intelligence, and ruthlessness. The courtroom was a battleground of perception, strategy, and psychology, where Luciano's resilience and adaptability were tested as never before. Though physically constrained by law, his mind remained a center of strategy, influence, and foresight. The fall had begun, but it also marked the transition from street-level dominance to a more complex, enduring form of power, a testament to Luciano's genius, even in the face of defeat. After more than a decade behind bars, Lucky Luciano's life took a dramatic turn. In 1946, leveraging the goodwill he had earned during World War II by assisting U.S. authorities in securing New York's docks, he negotiated a commutation of his sentence. Freedom, however, came with a cost. He was deported to Italy, a land he barely knew and a world far removed from the streets he had meticulously ruled. Exile was both liberation and punishment, removing him physically from the empire he had built while leaving his influence intact. Returning to Sicily was a psychological jolt. Though technically home, the island was unfamiliar, post-war, and unstable. The old-world codes of the Sicilian underworld contrasted sharply with the modernized criminal structures Luciano had pioneered in America. For the first time, he faced the reality that power was now more abstract, exercised indirectly rather than through direct control. Yet Luciano adapted, observing, reflecting, and leveraging his remaining networks to maintain influence from afar. In exile, Luciano became more introspective. Removed from daily operations, he considered the arc of his life, the rise from the streets, the wars, betrayals, and the empire he had built. The period fostered philosophical reflection, the fragility of loyalty, the inevitability of betrayal, and the human limits of control. Despite being physically constrained, he remained a figure of symbolic and practical authority, advising allies and influencing American organized crime through intermediaries and correspondence. Emotionally, exile was a mixture of loss, freedom, and contemplation. Luciano was separated from the streets where he had exerted tangible control, yet he retained the psychological and strategic influence that defined his genius. His life in Italy illustrated the enduring nature of power rooted in intellect, foresight, and organizational design, rather than mere presence. Exile was simultaneously a humbling end and a testament to his lasting legacy, demonstrating that even when removed from immediate authority, the systems and structures he created continued to shape the underworld he had transformed. Lucky Luciano's conviction and imprisonment marked a dramatic turning point. Yet even behind the cold stone walls of prison, his influence did not fade. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who were broken by confinement, Luciano viewed incarceration not as an end, but as a new arena in which to exercise power, strategy, and control. Prison, for him, was less a punishment and more a challenge, an opportunity to test the resilience of his empire and to demonstrate that true leadership transcends physical presence. Luciano's time behind bars began at the infamous Sing Sing Correctional Facility, a place notorious for its strict discipline, overcrowding, and violence. Yet within these constraints, he quickly adapted. Drawing on his natural charisma, intelligence, and understanding of human behavior, he established influence over both inmates and certain prison staff. He identified those who could serve as intermediaries with the outside world, leveraged relationships for protection, and quietly maintained communication channels with his network. His ability to project authority, even in an environment designed to strip men of power, was a testament to his psychological acuity. Maintaining control from prison required innovative strategies. Luciano understood that his network outside needed structure capable of functioning without him physically present. Through the commission, his associates continued operations in gambling, bootlegging. As prohibition had recently ended, other ventures took prominence, labor rackets, and other enterprises. Regularly, messages and directives were transmitted discreetly, ensuring continuity in decision-making and operational oversight. By creating a system that could withstand his absence, Luciano demonstrated a level of foresight rarely seen in criminal organizations, effectively turning his imprisonment into a test of organizational strength. The psychological aspect of his power behind bars was critical. Luciano knew that his reputation alone could maintain loyalty and discipline. Stories of his past ruthlessness, combined with the understanding that he remained a strategic force despite confinement, ensured that allies, subordinates, and even rivals treated his directives with respect. Fear, respect, and the perception of omnipresence became tools that allowed him to exert influence without physical presence. In this way, prison became less a limitation and more a platform from which to demonstrate the durability of his leadership. Moreover, Luciano's intellect and pragmatism extended to interactions with law enforcement and political figures. Recognizing the potential benefits of cooperation, he cultivated relationships that would prove useful in negotiations for sentence reductions or future opportunities. Notably, during World War II, Luciano leveraged his strategic insight to assist U.S. authorities in securing the docks and preventing sabotage in New York, a calculated move that would later play a pivotal role in his sentence commutation. Even while confined, Luciano understood the value of positioning himself as indispensable to power structures beyond the criminal world. Inside prison, Luciano also honed a more subtle form of governance. He mediated disputes among inmates, established informal hierarchies, and maintained order within his sphere of influence. These actions mirrored the principles he had used to build the Commission, a combination of authority, strategy, and the careful management of human behavior. Even in confinement, Luciano was effectively exercising leadership, demonstrating that true power is often a function of intellect and influence rather than mobility or physical dominance. The broader impact of Luciano's time in prison extended to the Mafia itself. His absence tested the resilience of the Commission and the operational autonomy of his associates. Loyal lieutenants assumed responsibility for day-to-day decisions, while strategic coordination with Luciano ensured that the organization remained cohesive. This period proved that the structures he had built were sustainable, capable of surviving the temporary removal of their central figure. In doing so, Luciano's imprisonment became a proving ground for the durability of modern organized crime, a testament to his foresight and ingenuity. Emotionally and psychologically, this period was complex. Luciano faced the realities of confinement, limited freedom, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of violence from other inmates. Yet, his approach remained calculated, disciplined, and strategic. He reframed his situation not as punishment, but as a test, focusing on influence, leverage, and long-term positioning. By turning adversity into an opportunity, Luciano demonstrated a resilience and adaptability that distinguished him from other crime figures of his era. Luciano also recognized the symbolic value of maintaining power from prison. For the broader criminal community, it sent a message that true leadership was not diminished by physical absence. Loyalty, structure, and strategic foresight mattered more than brute force or proximity. In this way, Luciano redefined the notion of authority in the underworld. Power was measured not merely by presence on the streets, but by the ability to shape events, direct operations, and command loyalty across distances. By the late 1940s, Luciano's influence behind bars reached its zenith. His assistance during World War II, combined with ongoing management of the Commission, positioned him for eventual negotiation and early release. He had turned imprisonment into an arena for demonstrating leadership, consolidating influence, and reinforcing the durability of the systems he had created. Whereas others might have been weakened or forgotten, Luciano emerged from prison with his reputation intact, his network intact, and his strategic vision validated. In retrospect, Luciano's ability to wield power from behind bars underscores his genius as both a strategist and a leader. It was a period that tested every skill he had cultivated: negotiation, psychology, foresight, and influence. While incarceration removed him physically from the streets, it could not diminish his authority. On the contrary, it showcased the strength of the structures he had built and the enduring nature of the empire he had envisioned. Power behind bars was not merely survival, it was mastery. Luciano demonstrated that leadership is as much about intellect, strategy, and perception as it is about presence, force, or intimidation. Even in confinement, he remained the architect of organized crime, proving that true influence extends beyond physical limitations. His time in prison became a testament to the enduring power of foresight, planning, and psychological mastery, a chapter that would define the next stage of his life and the evolution of the modern mafia. Lucky Luciano's life was a symphony of ambition, strategy, and ruthless efficiency, and his legacy resonates far beyond the streets of New York, where he first rose to power. He did more than survive the chaos of gang wars and law enforcement scrutiny. He reshaped the very architecture of organized crime, creating systems that endured long after his exile and death. Luciano transformed the mafia from a fragmented collection of violent factions into a structured, strategic, and enduring institution, demonstrating that power is as much about intellect, organization, and vision as it is about fear or violence. The most enduring aspect of Luciano's legacy is the Commission. This governing body institutionalized cooperation among rival families, turning perpetual conflict into a managed, strategic enterprise. By implementing rules for resolving disputes, allocating territories, and overseeing criminal operations, Luciano created a model of organized crime that prioritized stability and efficiency over chaos. The Commission became a blueprint for modern criminal enterprises, demonstrating that long-term success requires governance, foresight, and the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. Through it, Luciano ensured that the mafia would survive, evolve, and thrive long after his personal presence had been removed. Luciano's influence also extended into the psychological and cultural dimensions of crime. He showed that leadership is not merely the capacity to intimidate or control, but the ability to inspire loyalty, manipulate human behavior, and anticipate the actions of both allies and adversaries. His strategies were sophisticated, blending diplomacy, fear, and incentives to maintain cohesion. The lessons he imparted about loyalty, betrayal, risk, and strategy remain embedded in the ethos of organized crime and continue to inform criminal psychology studies and law enforcement approaches today. Culturally, Luciano became an archetype, the modern mobster, combining charisma, intelligence, and audacity. He occupies a unique place in both history and popular imagination, influencing literature, film, and media depictions of the mafia. His persona embodies the tension between myth and reality, the allure of power, and the moral complexities inherent in human ambition. He is simultaneously feared, respected, and studied, a symbol of the intricate interplay between criminal genius and human fallibility. Yet Luciano's legacy is also a study in duality. While he orchestrated systems of enduring power, he was not invulnerable. Arrest, betrayal, and exile underscore the limits of even the greatest ambition. His life reminds us that power is contingent on relationships, context, and circumstance. Even a figure as brilliant as Luciano is subject to forces beyond personal control, the law, human unpredictability, and the inexorable passage of time. These contradictions make his story compelling. He was both a master of systems and a man vulnerable to them, a figure of nearly unmatched influence yet subject to human limitations. Ultimately, Lucky Luciano's legacy lies not merely in the crimes he orchestrated, but in the systems, strategies, and psychological insights he developed. He redefined the mechanics of organized crime, proving that vision, intellect, and adaptability can shape not only the underworld, but the broader narrative of power itself. His life remains a testament to the complexities of human ambition, the interplay of fear and loyalty, and the enduring impact of one man's strategic genius on the course of history.